Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the eighth talk of the Kant and the Needs of Reason series organized by Türkiye Kant Society and Kadir University. It's a pleasure to have all you here tonight. And we're especially delighted to host our speaker, Professor Holly Wilson from Louisiana State University. Professor Wilson is a distinguished scholar of Kantian philosophy, whose work focuses in particular on Kant's anthropology, philosophy of history, and the conceptual foundation of race in Enlightenment thought. Her research engages directly with one of the most actually debated areas of Kant's scholarship today, and how to interpret Kant's writing on race within the broader systematic framework of overall philosophy. Professor Wilson is the author of the monograph Kant's Pragmatic Anthropology, Its Origin, Meaning and Critical Significance, a widely recognized contribution to Kant studies that offers a comprehensive account of Kant's anthropological project and its place within the critical philosophy. And in addition to her book, she published a number of influential articles on Kant's view of race, human nature, and history, and that all contributed significantly to Kantian scholarship. Tonight, the title of her talk is Kant, Racism and the Boundaries of Human History. In her lecture tonight, Professor Wilson will address this complex issue and often controversial one on the question of how to understand Kant's view on race in relevance to his account of overall human development and historical context. So please join me, warmly welcome to Professor Wilson. Thanks for accepting our invitation, and floor is yours.
Oh, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and greetings to everyone from Louisiana. And I just want to tell you what an honor it is to be able to share these thoughts that I have. I know I'm in the minority in Kant scholars who say that Kant is not a racist, so I'm a little bit humble about that, and I appreciate any kind of feedback I can get because I can't see it any differently. So I'm really grateful I get this opportunity to share my thoughts with you. So the paper that I'm sharing right now is really under review, not the same one, but much of the content is being under reviewed right now for publication. So this is you're getting a chance to hear it for the first time. This paper will address the fact that Kant uses the same concept of natural predispositions, Naturanlage, in both his writings on natural history, heredity and race, and on human history, but will argue that Kant understands the concept differently in the two genres. Kant distinguishes the two concepts of natural predispositions by one, associating the natural history type with germs, kaima, and two, by claiming the human history types of natural predispositions are associated with reason, as articulated in the religion. Natural history predispositions are efficient causes of skin color, while human history natural predispositions are presuppositions for the exercise of reason, agency, and final causality. Natural history, natural predispositions make it possible for human beings to be human and to adapt to their physical environment, while human history, natural predispositions make it possible to exercise reason in the development of technical skills, pragmatic skills, moral personality, and ultimately create culture, civilization, and morality. Clearly, distinguishing between these concepts of natural predispositions allows us to understand Kant's controversial statements regarding race and culture in a way that does not necessitate we identify Kant as a racist, because he's not a biological determinist, an essentialist about culture and civilization. Namely, when he talks about the socio-cultural character of races, he's not doing natural history, but human history. Distinguishing the two meanings of these same concepts of natural predispositions illuminates Kant's hierarchical evaluation of cultures. In this light, Kant is not articulating a hierarchy of races, but rather a non-racist hierarchy of cultures. In addition, Kant asserts in the critique of teleological judgment that sciences are formed by different principles and must stay within their boundaries and not wander into other sciences. Very likely he would have intended that natural history and human history not mix either, since they assume different principles of causality. This paper will then examine a few of Kant's alleged racist statements in this light to confirm that he's evaluating populations based on cultural development and within the science of human history, rather than evaluating populations based on skin color within the science of natural history. The natural predispositions. Kant uses the terms natural predispositions in both his articles on natural history and human history, but he means different things in both genres. He does not mean the same thing, and he distinguishes the use by qualifying that the natural predispositions in human history are based in reason or associated with reason, while natural predispositions are aligned with germs in natural history. Conflating these two senses of natural predispositions leads some Kant scholars to conclude that Kant is a racist. In the religion within the bounds of mere reason, which is about human history and not natural history, Kant writes, quote, "The predispositions to humanity can be brought under the general title of self-love, which is physical and yet involves comparison, for which reason is required," unquote. Both the predispositions to humanity and to personality regard human beings as rational beings. Even the title of this work indicates that we're dealing with reason and not natural history. This distinction between the use of natural predispositions also then provides a clear boundary between natural history and human history. Natural history, quoting Kant, would only consist in tracing back as far as analogy permits the connection between certain present-day conditions of the things in nature and their causes in earlier times, according to the laws of efficient causality, which we do not make up but derive from the powers of nature as it presents itself to us now, unquote. Human history, on the other hand, is the story of human freedom and final causality, and that comes from the conjectural beginnings. Human history presupposes a different principle than efficient causality. Quote, "The will as the power of desire is one of the many natural causes in the world, namely the one that acts in accordance with concepts," unquote. As Peter McLaughlin argues, these can be formal causes or final causes that operate based on concepts. In the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant argues that the human being is equipped with, quote, "an aptitude for purposes generally, that is, in a way that leaves that being free," unquote. We do not choose our skin color, but humans do choose to exercise their talents as skills, and they do choose to behave prudentially and morally. And thus Kant's own philosophy would recognize a clear boundary between the concept of human races and human culture, even though Kant conflates them in comments he makes about races and their character. Kant speaks of races when he is talking about national character, because he does not have a named nation state that corresponds to some populations, so he designates them with racial terms. We know this conflation is happening because his discussion of the character of races is included at the end of the discussion of national character, both in the observations on the feeling of the beautiful and sublime, and also in his lectures on anthropology, specifically in the Menschenkunde. Kant is talking about these populations, but they do not have national boundaries like the French, German, and English. We can tell that Kant is not doing natural history in the anthropology lectures and in the observations. He is working on human history, and hence what he says should be read in that light and not as natural history. I'm just going to turn that off. Even within human history, however, we should distinguish between those elements that are attributable to nature and those elements that are attributable to free will. In the Friedlander student notes, we read, quote, "With the human being, we divide everything in nature and freedom. We count natural aptitude, talent, and temperament to nature, but mind, heart, and character to freedom. Something can displease me about a human being due to nature, but I cannot impute guilt to him for it." Unquote. That's from the Friedlander. Kant is delineating a boundary between natural causality and human causality here. We cannot attribute the causality of reason to all attributes that nature endows humans with. The character of the races and nations are partially attributed to nature and hence not to free will. Whereas natural history was fully natural and regarded efficient causality, human history is only partially natural, but also regards human free will and final causality. Whereas temperament is based on the union of natural aptitude and talent, character is based on freely chosen principles and must be acquired. Human races, which are distinguished based on skin color for Kant, differentiate human beings, but Kant also asserts in the Anthropology that the natural predispositions are shared in common among all human beings as members of the human species. The germs and natural predispositions that give rise to skin color in Kant's works on natural history do not give rise to reason or culture, according to Kant. However, the natural predispositions that Kant speaks of in the religion, the anthropology, and in the pedagogy that are associated with reason provide the framework for culture and civilization. I will show how he connects the natural predispositions and culture and civilization in his lectures on anthropology later on in this essay. Kant holds both in the natural history and in human history that all human beings share the same natural predispositions. In the natural history, Kant is using natural predispositions to argue why human beings are all the same species, because they have the same phylum. But he also uses natural predispositions to justify why human beings can adapt to various environments and climates. This is his epigenetic argument. The natural predispositions and germs get fixed once adaptation occurs, and skin color does not subsequently adapt to new environments, according to Kant. So one could make the argument that Kant is a biological determinist in natural history. However, he is not a biological determinist in human history. This is so because the germ of reason plays a role in human history, and the use of reason is evidence of human free will for Kant. Humans create culture through the development of their aptitudes and talents, and therefore the state of those cultures is partially attributable to human choice and not simply to the natural aptitude and natural predispositions. All races have the germ of reason and the four natural predispositions, but have different aptitudes toward developing the skills of culture and civilization, according to Kant. All human beings have different natural aptitudes. Environment, as natural and as cultural, also plays a role in how these aptitudes get developed and expressed. But Kant's position is clear that free will is also involved. So he's not a biological determinist and not fully an environmental determinist either. That some cultures did not develop the kind of civilization that Europe developed can be attributed partially to the universal aptitude toward laziness that all human beings share and the environmental conditions that permit easy food gathering. But it can also be attributed to free decisions that populations make, for instance, about how to relate to women. We will see in the observations that Kant is highly critical of cultures or populations which choose to denigrate women. Once culture reaches a certain level, though, the mechanism of unsocial sociability kicks in and impels the culture of skills forward to the point of the development of civilization and the culture of propriety and prudence where women thrive. This distinction between the concepts of natural predispositions has implications for interpreting Kant's comments on human cultures and populations. Sometimes Kant conflates racial groups with human cultures in some comments, but his own careful distinctions would require that he distinguish between human culture and racial groups. Human culture, or what we sometimes call ethnicity today, is based on reason, but racial groups are based in skin color, which has no foundation in reason, according to Kant. There's no evidence in Kant's works on natural history where he designates racial groups that reason plays a role in the heritability of skin color. However, in his works on human history, it's clear that reason and human choices are at the basis of the exercise of the natural predispositions. In the religion within the bounds of mere reason, he identifies three natural predispositions: animality, humanity, and personality. Whereas in the anthropology, from a pragmatic point of view, he identifies the following natural predispositions: technical, pragmatic, and moral. In the pedagogy, Kant speaks of the four goals of education as discipline of animality, 2, the scholastic mechanical formation with regard to skillfulness, 3, pragmatic formation with regard to prudence, and 4, moral formation with regard to ethics, unquote. If Kant intends to be consistent, then we should probably conclude that he intends for there to be three natural predispositions that are associated with reason: the technical predisposition, the pragmatic predisposition, and the moral predisposition. I argue that in my book. Kant probably collapsed the technical and pragmatic predispositions into the predisposition to humanity in the religion. The predisposition to animality is not associated with reason, but discipline of animal inclinations and tendencies do require reason. The predisposition of animality is purposive and aims at preservation of the species, among other things, and this would be an appropriate point of contact with the natural predispositions in Kant's works on natural history, because skin color is in natural history is purposive for the preservation of the species. However, Kant deliberately distinguishes animality from the technical predisposition, the predisposition to humanity, the pragmatic, and the moral predisposition, because the latter all require reason. Kant is clear that heritable skin color is not something one can impact through one's free actions other than propagation. One cannot simply choose one's skin color, but one can choose to develop one's technical and pragmatic skills and choose to be a moral person. In regard to human character, Kant asserts that the human being is free by nature and all human beings are by nature equal. Kant's vision of the earliest development of culture. Kant's theory of early cultural development is articulated in the conjectural beginning. Right from the start, Kant tells us he's talking about human history and not natural history. He also differentiates human abilities as skills that are acquired and not inherited. Quote, "For if they were innate, then they would also be inherited, which, however, experience contradicts," unquote. Clearly, skills are not like skin color, which is invariably heritable. Skills are acquired through actions. Skin color is acquired through propagation. So we have a clear boundary between human history and natural history. In the pedagogy, Kant will assert that human beings are in need of education, and in the anthropology, Kant asserts humans need to be educated toward the good. That also establishes a clear boundary between skin color, which is not in need of education, and skills which do require education. Kant argues that human skills like speaking and discourse require thinking. Quote, "The first human being could therefore stand and walk, he could speak, even discourse. That is, speak according to connected words and concepts, hence think, unquote. At first, Kant tells us in the conjectural beginnings, human beings were motivated by instinct, but soon, Kant tells us, reason began to stir. Reason, quote, with the assistance of the power of the imagination, began to concoct desires that were even contrary to natural drives, unquote. Reason then interfered with the preservation of the species and satisfaction of animal desire by concealing the sex organs. Reason introduced the deliberate expectation of the future. Finally, reason elevated human beings above animals and identified them as the genuine end of nature. In doing so, all human beings entered into an equality with all rational beings of whatever rank they might be, namely in regard to the claim of being himself and end of also being esteemed as such by everyone else and of being used by no one merely as a means to other ends, unquote. This means that all human beings are equal, even if some have natural gifts that make them superior to others. No one has a right to, quote, deal and dispose with him merely at their discretion, unquote. So in the context of Kant's theory of human history, he's articulating the importance of reason, which gives rise to this most moral of all insights, human equality and dignity. Human beings do not need a highly developed moral theory or highly developed civilization to achieve this insight. Even in the earliest stages of human history, human beings recognized their distinction from animals and their equality with all other human beings. The most that they needed in order to recognize their dignity was simply to understand that a sheep's wool was made for their uses and that they were thus ends. I would note that this insight comes in the conjectural beginning and is situated at the same time Kant was writing his articles on race and inheritance of skin color. What follows from this insight is that all human beings can conceive of their human dignity in how they treat animals as being there for their use, and thus seeing themselves as ends. Human beings then conclude, in contrast to animals, that they are all equal from the perspective of human reason. Human beings in the conjectural beginning are not there to be used, and I may also add that means they're not there to be enslaved. No matter what skills they have that differentiate them or what culture they have, they are still equal and should not be used as a mere means at another's discretion. Reason creates equality between human beings. Natural skills may differentiate human beings, and the abilities of culture may differentiate cultures, but reason makes all rational beings equal and grants them dignity. But reason also, quote, drives him irresistibly toward the development of capacities placed in him and does not allow him to return to the condition of crudity and simplicity out of which it pulled him, unquote. Reason thus also impels human beings into a state of inequality as they exercise their various skills. So in this following passage drawn from the review of Herder, which was written around the same time, Kant qualifies the kind of natural predispositions he's talking about by calling them mental presuppositions. Quote, one can prove if one wants to that Americans and Negroes are each a race sunk beneath the remaining members of the human species in their mental presuppositions. But on the other side, by just as apparent records that are as regards their natural predispositions, they are to be estimated equal to every other inhabitant of the world. So it remains the choice of the philosopher whether he wants to assume differences of nature or wants to judge everything in accordance with the principle of Tao cum Shenu. This passage, unquote, this passage clearly distinguishes mental presuppositions from natural predispositions. Mental presuppositions can be unequally distributed in human beings, but the natural predispositions are equally distributed. Mental presuppositions have to do with the kinds of cultural achievements a population has accomplished. Natural predispositions, however, are distributed equally, and each population shares in the dignity of being in the human species. In his Friedlander anthropology lecture, Kant asserts, quote, "Innate to human nature are germs which develop and can achieve the perfection for which they are determined. Who has seen a savage Indian or Greenlander, should he indeed believe that there is a germ innate to this same being to become just such a man in accordance with Parisian fashion as another would become? He has, however, the same germs as a civilized human being, only they have not yet developed," unquote. Kant goes on to ask, should it not be possible that all could be likewise disposed? While he concludes that germs are innate to humanity. Although Kant wondered empirically if some populations could adapt to European culture and civilization, he did not doubt they had the natural predispositions to do so. It should be clear then that human history is driven forward by reason, not by inheritance and efficient causality, which is why human history and natural history must be clearly distinguished. Kant cannot possibly equate races with cultures and national identity, since cultures arise out of reason, races arise out of germs and natural predispositions and their interaction with the environment. Natural history is not the result of human choices. Skin color is not something one chooses. Human history is chosen. Kant's thinking is to distinguish ultimately between race and culture. For this reason, I believe we must conclude that Kant using racial terms to identify cultural entities when he talks about populations in America, Africa, Asia, and makes conclusions about human skills and abilities and about cultural capacities. He does not have the terms that he can use to designate cultural types in other populations, so he apparently is using racial terms as a shorthand. Robert Loudon calls this conflating. We can observe this happening in the observations on the feeling of the beautiful and sublime, and now I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the observations. Kant's conflation of race, terms, and culture. Negroes and Americans and Asians and Indians are terms that Kant uses to designate populations in the same way he uses Germans, French, English to designate populations. In the observations in the fourth section, Kant makes the argument that there are national characters, and he lists the Spaniard, the Italian, the Frenchman, the Englishman, the German, the Dutchman, and then he begins to address the other parts of the world and starts with the Arab, the Persians, the Japanese, the Indians, the Chinese, and continues on to the Negroes of Africa and the savages of North America. Following Hume, he believed it was possible to characterize various populations as populations. He called this the character of nations. He was clear that not all people in each population exhibited the features that he identified, and that individual people could depart from these broad generalizations through freedom of choice. But in his essays on natural history, where he is defining race, he only defines race in terms of heritable skin color. He never says that temperament, for instance, is heritable. Skin color is unfailingly heritable, but temperament is not listed as something that is unfailingly heritable. Nonetheless, he thinks populations once identified by skin color can also be characterized like the French, the German, and the English in terms of national identity. In the mentioned Kunde, Kant speaks of the character of four races under the heading of the character of nations. He speaks of the character of races in the same terms he uses for nations. The same terms show up: incentives, training, culture, talents, and so on. He believed at that time, according to student notes, that one could characterize a race like a nation. This is really conflating race and nation, which in the 21st century we carefully distinguish. Even in these student notes, Kant distinguishes aspects of character that are natural, gift of fortune, and aspects that are chosen, good character, fundamental predisposition. He does not say that gifts of fortune are inherited, but rather are found in the natural predispositions. Talents, for instance, are natural, but skill is something that one can exercise in order to develop one's talents. And this is a longer quote. Natural aptitude in general is that which in the human being is fit for a purpose. It is a human being's ability to learn and nature's call to the use of one's talents. It is a property through which one is fit and usable for purposes. Therefore, it is passive. By contrast, talent, when one is skillful, is using something for purposes. It is therefore active. Natural aptitude consists, 1, in the capacity to take on forms, 2, in the capacity to invent. Capacity is specifically attributed to the natural predispositions and is properly called natural aptitude. Ability, by contrast, is also called talent, even if it too is natural predisposition, unquote. Natural aptitude and ability are both attributed to natural predispositions, but one is passive and the other is active. Kant does not say that natural aptitude is inherited. Natural aptitude is something found in a population that makes a kind of characterization possible, but it's not like skin color. The character of the French or German is not inherited infallibly. In the Friedlander lecture notes, Kant identifies where the character of nation is located: in the mind of the entire nation. Nor are the characters of races inherited. Kant is aware that describing national character, he is engaged in something that is questionable. And this is a quote from the Friedlander. It is indeed to dare a lot to want to determine the characters of entire nations. However, it is surely possible that nevertheless something characteristic could be determined in the whole of a nation, which through the long duration, through climate and other causes, has in the end received a unique ingrained constitution, unquote. But Kant comes to explain in the Anthropology that this attempt to characterize nations and races is risky. Quoting here, hereditary maxims, or those which have become, as it were, second nature through long usage, as well as those maxims grafted upon them, which express the sensibility of a people, are only so many risky attempts to classify the varieties in the natural tendency of entire peoples, and more empirically for geographers than according to the principles of reason for philosophers, unquote. He is clearly cautioning us here about the legitimacy of characterizing populations based on natural aptitudes, which are found in the natural predispositions. Nonetheless, in his early writings, he does conflate race and culture or national identity, and this leads to statements that appear to be prejudicial to our 21st century perceptions. For instance, in the observations where Kant speaks of a fellow who is black from head to foot, he's not speaking of a race of people who have black skin, because he mentions the geographical location, in the land of the blacks, in the statement he makes before he draws some conclusions about the character of those populations. Kant uses the example of a Negro carpenter. This person is reported to have said, quote, you whites are real fools, for first you conceive so much to your wives, and then you complain when they drive you crazy, unquote. This statement appears to be misogynistic, but it is also a criticism of white men, European civilization, and their elevation of women. This passage must be understood within its context in the observations. Previously in this passage, Kant is discussing how women are being treated in various lands, in the Orient, in the lands of the blacks, and in Canada. His point is that women are often in the deepest slavery in the lands of the blacks, and he asks if we could expect anything better than what is found there. He mentions the cowardly person who oppresses the weaker person. This is a judgment on the society Kant perceives in the land of the blacks. He is judging their culture is not courageous in its treatment of women. For Kant, how women are treated is the measure of a society's civilization. This is why Kant judges the state of the culture in the land of the blacks as not as advanced as in Europe. Kant is not saying that all people with black skin are stupid when he judges the statement made by this Negro carpenter. He is evaluating the state of his culture. It is not black skin that makes him dumb, but rather the culture from which he comes that makes him ignorant of the value of femininity. Kant argues that, quote, in a crude state of nature, woman is a domestic animal, unquote. In a civilized society, on the contrast, the finer feelings that belong to culture, namely those of sociability and propriety, make, quote, this sex man's ruler, unquote. But apparently the Negro carpenter thinks men should be women's ruler. For Kant, then, this is an ignorant statement because this man comes from a culture that does not elevate women as Europeans do. When Kant says the carpenter is black from head to foot, it is a shorthand way of saying the carpenter comes from a culture and geographical area where people are black. It does not mean that anyone who has black skin is stupid. Nowhere does Kant argue that stupidity is heritable. Human beings must be educated, and if they're not educated, then they are ignorant. And when you're angry about something another person says, one might say the person who says such things are stupid instead of just saying they're uneducated. Kant believes that women are the weaker sex and that they are being mistreated, kept in prison in Asia and enslaved in Africa. Kant is judging this person's culture, which he believes is ignorant and uneducated. He has no national term for this culture, so he uses color of skin to designate his culture. This is not racism. Kant is not asserting that all black people are stupid and that they inherit stupidity, but that that is what some Kantians appear to conclude who take Kant's statement out of context and interpret it in light of 21st century implicit racism theory. Instead, we need to see this comment in light of Kant's theory of culture and civilization. That Kant is interested in evaluating different cultural types can be seen in the conjectural beginning. Kant closes the story of human history in the conjectural beginning with an account of the development of human culture. He identifies the first stage of human culture as savage life of hunters. This way of life is also supplemented by unsettled digging of roots or gathering of fruits. This is a hunter-gatherer culture. Then there is a transition to sowing or planting. The domestication of animals, which he calls the pastoral life, is more peaceful than agriculture or planting, but the conflict between the farmer and the shepherd already exhibits that conflict is the basis of human society and culture. Agriculture led to the distancing of people from one another and represents the third epoch. Towns arose as farmers sought to protect themselves from savage hunters and roaming hordes of herdsmen. Now with towns arose the opportunity for the arts and the need for civil constitution. Inequality between human beings also arose because of the exercise of skills. So the civil constitution developed to protect equality between human beings. So now let me get to the heart of the matter. Is it biological determinism or environmental determinism that Kant holds? Kant argues that Americans and Negroes have no incentives and nothing that causes a drive. Kant also believes that all human beings are by nature lazy. Quote, the human being is, however, lazy by nature. He does nothing other than that to which nature and necessity drives him, unquote. Human beings, this means human beings need incentives to work and develop their talents and aptitudes. These incentives may be the germs Kant is referring to in the idea. The germs do not get activated without the appropriate environment to trigger them. That environment is not just the natural environment, but also the cultural environment. Kant seems to think that some natural environments do not conduce to the development of industry. He has the Tahitians and the South Sea Islanders in mind, because human beings nourished themselves from trees like apes and did not need to work due to the lack of needs, unquote. Some cultural realities do conduce to conflict and the development of industry. Without sufficient development of settled life in towns, the drive of unsocial sociability will not arise, and thus the germs or incentives and impulse to industry that move culture to civilization will not express themselves, because the culture is not developed enough. The population cannot develop civilization because they do not have the foundation for it in culture. In a reflection, Kant opines, quote, the Negro can be disciplined and cultivated, never, however, genuinely civilized. He lapses from himself into savagery, unquote. Savagery for Kant is a culture of hunter-gatherers. This statement is about culture and the lack of it, not lack of moral discipline, which is how a 21st century scholar might interpret the passage. In student notebooks, we also find the statement, the Negroes and Americans will hence never be capable of founding an orderly civil society for themselves, unquote. This is true for Kant, not because these populations don't have the biological makeup or natural aptitude for civil society, but because they don't have the cultural prerequisites. Michael McNulty, draws the conclusion from these statements attributed to Kant, quote, such passages suggest that these cultural deficiencies are for Kant unchangeable and part of their racial nature, unquote. But McNulty's statement conflates natural history, natural predispositions, with human history, natural predispositions. McNulty goes on to assert, quote, in Kant's view, indigenous Americans and Black people are determined by nature to possess their cultural deficiencies, unquote. This conclusory interpretation is implying biological determinism that connects populations in Kant's time to populations in our time. But populations then and now are quite different. True, there are statements attributed to Kant in student lecture notes that sound like Kant is attributing the incapacity for civilization to a population's biological nature, even though Kant doesn't use this term. In the Pillau lecture note, we find this statement attributed to Kant. The Americans have such relations in their nature that they now should become no more perfect. The Negroes, however, are also no more susceptible of any further civilizing, but they have instinct and discipline which is lacking in the Americans, unquote. If this statement were implying biological determinism, it would not make sense given the fact that Kant believes all populations share the same human history, natural predispositions. However, it does make sense if he is affirming environmental determinism. Kant believes that skin color adapts a population to the specific environment, that this adaptation does not go away after a population is transported to or migrates to a new environment. Adaptation is evolutionary in that it can be halfway complete, and once it's complete, it is not changeable. Kant noticed that Negroes who were freed from slavery did not adapt to civil society in England. He argues that gypsies too never adapted to European culture. Gypsies who, quote, have never been able to bring about in their progeny a sort that would be fit for farmers or manual laborers, unquote. He also believed that Americans were not fully adapted to their environment, but had migrated before developing the full nature of their natural predispositions. Kant maintains regarding Americans, quote, that their natural predisposition did not achieve the perfect susceptibility, did not achieve a perfect suitability for any climate can be seen from the circumstance that hardly another reason can be given for why this race, which is too weak for hard labor, too indifferent for industry, and incapable for any culture, although there is enough of it as an example and encouragement nearby, ranks still far below the Negro, who stands on the lowest of all other steps that we have named as differences of races, unquote. This statement, however, does not necessitate McNulty's conclusion that, quote, racial features are unfailingly heritable, since Kant makes it clear that the only feature that determines a race and is unfailingly heritable is skin color. Cultural features are not invariably inherited, and Kant also is referencing the climate, so we know this is a kind of environmental determinism rather than biological determinism. Nowhere does Kant define race as possessing certain aptitudes, physical ability, and temperament that are invariably heritable. What Kant does in some places is use racial identity terms to designate cultural populations so he can characterize them like he characterizes nations. This is apparent in Reflection 1520, which McNulty considers a decisive indication of Kant's racism. Cultural features, however, also reflect adaptation to the environment. Kant is wondering whether these environmentally adapted cultural features are fixed and not susceptible to change in a new environment. He is playing with the idea of environmental determinism in a cultural sense, which I argued in a previous article. Kant's statements about some populations not being capable of civilization must be read as environmental determinism. The traits of civilization cannot manifest in human beings in a context where human history has not advanced enough to manifest them. It's not the case that any races are incapable of human history, because all share the same human history natural predispositions, but that human history must advance in a certain way that has to do with the development of food production first, and then culture second, and then civilization can occur. This is a necessary incremental process. When we turn to Kant's further work on natural history, his critique of teleological judgment, we see that he is keen to keep sciences with different principles separate, and we should note that point with respect to natural history and human history. Although he may have been referencing the difference between the sciences of natural history and theology, we can apply this distinction to the sciences of natural history and human history, because what he says is relevant there as well. Kant writes, quote, every science is of itself a system, and is not enough that in it we build in principles in accordance with principles thus proceed technically. Rather, in it as freestanding building, we must also work architectonically and treat it not like an addition and as a part of another building, but as a whole by itself, although afterwards we can construct a transition from this building to the other, or vice versa, unquote. In other words, each science has its own boundaries that are drawn up because the principles are valid within those boundaries. But Kant warns that crossing boundaries with principles can lead to confusion. Quote, hence, natural science must not jump over its boundaries in order to bring within itself as an indigenous principle that to whose concept no experience at all can ever be adequate, and upon which we are authorized to venture only after the completion of natural science, unquote. One can build bridges once scientific boundaries are firmly established and the legitimacy of the application of the principles has been shown. The lesson we can draw from this warning is that we should seek to understand Kant's works in natural history and the range of the concept of race as skin color thoroughly before we start interpreting its relevance for human history. Race as skin color originates in the ability of germs and natural predispositions to adapt to various environments. National character and racial character, on the other hand, must be understood not as adaptations to the environment, but as originating in various natural aptitudes which nature implanted and which manifest themselves in populations who reside in the same place and whose character are partially determined by human free will, namely by their mind. In the critique of teleological judgment, Kant proposes a bridge between the two sciences of natural history and human history, purposiveness. Skin is purposive for adapting human beings to their environment so that they can survive, because they are organisms that are ends for which other things are means. In other words, they have intrinsic purposiveness. The principle of unsociable sociability is purposive for driving human beings toward a further development from culture to civilization in which human beings fully develop as a species through the diversification of skills, the development of their civil dispositions, and the affirmation of their equality under a valid constitution. This is what nature can do and how the organization of nature can be understood to prepare human beings for their supersensible destiny as moral beings. So ultimately, the critique of teleological judgment also bridges over to moral philosophy, as Kant declares human beings not only the ultimate end of nature, but also the final end of nature, because it is only in human beings that one finds a supersensible moral law that raises human beings above nature and natural ends and makes them an end in themselves. Thus, we should again not conflate natural history with moral theory and conclude that some populations are not capable of morality, as McNulty does. We may be able to build bridges through the concept of purposiveness, but we should not conflate the sciences of natural history, human history, and morality because their architectonics are built on different principles. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Holly, for this very well-organized, mind-opening, and informative talk. I personally learned a lot, and I would like to ask a clarification question. But as the moderator, I think I should just, let the audience, the rest of the people, to speak in the first place and see if they have questions. You can either raise your hand or just speak. Yeah, I see Seniye's hand, so we can start with Seniye. Seniye, yes, please go ahead, ask the question. Thank you. Seniye, can you hear me? Seniye? I can see your hand, and but we don't hear you. No, we don't hear you. But if you write, we can read the chat. Obviously, there's a technical problem. If you could just type the question, we can continue like that. And meanwhile, if there is someone else having a question, we can have it. So, Saniye, you can type the question. Yeah, okay. I'd like to have a clarification question. Özlem, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I have a short question, actually. In this context, I would like to ask, is there a direct conceptual connection between the Keime and Anlagen and Kant's idea of epigenesis? I mean, more precisely, should Keime and Anlagen be understood as pre-given structures that limit epigenesis, or rather than as conditions that make an epigenetic model of development possible within Kant's philosophy?
Well, yeah, I think they make it possible for us to adapt. So that is really what we need for an epigenetic model. But they also play a role in instantiating what it means to be human. So they're preformative in that sense. So they're both epigenetic and preformative. They play two roles. So Kant has his cake and eats it too. But it's interesting how he uses in the idea, and I didn't really mention this, but he uses germs and references germs in the idea, and I just don't know if he's really consistent or not with the use of germs, because the idea is obviously about human history. And he also mentions that reason is a germ.
Reason?
Yeah, reason is a germ. There's the germ of reason.
Yeah.
Confusing enough. Yeah. Yeah. I have a question while Sani is typing her question. Again, thank you very much. This is not something that I specifically work on, but I'm at least very much sympathetic with the readings that are charitable rather than anachronically too much accusative of Kant. So I think your reading is helpful for me also. Just to clarify, you rightly suggested that there's a conflation, as Professor Lorden also puts it, between Kant's use of race and culture. And things coming by culture are kind of loose in the sense that they're not specifically hereditary rather than the skin color, which we directly associate with race. And the broader question, what shapes a culture, is something like very vogue in Kant, like in the mind of the entire nation, we have this characteristic of that culture or population, and we have very few, extra grounds for that group of people having that character, like, the climate or some other environmental things. But seemingly we don't have a definition exactly why that population is as such. That is what makes in the mind of the entire nation such laziness or something like that. So I would like to tie this picture with the broader question about efficient causality and final causality, because seemingly for Kant, teleology is the kind of final causality, and as the umbrella term shapes everything in the sense that the final cause of history is us, human species, to morality and to freedom, etc. To sum up. And in this perspective, where things are teleologically organized in the cultural framework, do you think that there's a hint of some sort of still pre-established, kind of predetermined, even though vaguely, place for each and every population and culture? Because we don't have much explanation why, according to Kant, a group of population is as such, other than the climate or the mind of entire nation. I mean, isn't still that there's a kind of teleological organization hierarchy that some cultures are likely to be considered more serving the overall purpose of history and the progress that we're heading towards?
Oh, so that, yeah, well, sometimes Kant does say things like that the white race has all the perfect talents. And I don't think that is saying, I think that's where he's conflating race and culture again. I think I don't think that you have to understand Kant. This is not part of my paper, but I don't think you have to understand him as saying that there's different purposes for different populations. I don't see that in Kant. I think what happens is that if you're going to draw some conclusions, you would have to draw the conclusion that, as he says, in the temperate zone, which is an environmental condition, certain populations thrived in terms of developing their talents, their culture and civilization and the civil constitution. And there's good reasons why they did, because the environment was temperate. It's not attributable to them. It's not attributable to the populations. It's attributable to the favorable environment that they were exercising their talents in. And so that whites are not superior. They just happen to have had an environment that was very conducive to developing culture and civilization. And that's how I would say it. And I would say that other populations had very difficult environments in order to that would have helped them develop civilization, elements of culture and civilization. I mean, just look at Africa itself. It just did not produce domesticated animals and was not able to domesticate the animals that were there. And Europe got seeds from Asia and was able to take it because it was the same temperate zone. They were able to migrate the seeds and use the seeds, and animals the same way. And so Europe had so many benefits, environmental benefits, that Africa did not have, and the Americas did not have that either. They couldn't horizontally gain from their neighbors. It had to be vertical, but you can't move vertically because that environment changes vertically.
So, okay, thank you. So it's again that cautiously we should keep natural history from separate from human history, as Kant himself does. Okay.
Yes, I think we should.
Yeah, okay, thank you. That's helpful. Seniye wrote her question on the chat.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, can you read it, Holly? I will read it for the people, but
okay.
to be able to track, it is written on the chat. Yeah, it's written on the chat.
I'll go ahead and read it. Holly, first of all, it's great to see you. Many thanks for your detailed, very clear present. I have two questions. There are many passages in this work that clearly makes reference to racial hierarchies. Humanity has its highest degree of perfection in the white race. The yellow Indians have a somewhat lesser talent. The Negroes much lower, and lowest of all is part of the human races. Whites contain all the impulses, triebfeder of nature. Yeah, he's conflating race and culture. Okay, so nature and affects, in affects and passions, all talents, all dispositions, culture, and civilization, and they can obey as well as govern. They're only ones who are always advanced toward perfection. Yeah, that's true. He says these things, but what is he saying? He's saying in culture and civilization, they are superior. And in talents, that's something given by nature. Talents are natural, right? So it seems like he's saying that as a race, they are biologically superior. And that's what's so offensive to everyone. And I agree with that, but I think he's really just saying that these are the talents that got expressed. The talents get expressed rather than the talents being inherent in the biological identity of whites. They got expressed because of the preferential environment in which the whites were living. Let's see. Hindus have incentives, but they have strong degree of composure in their philosophers.
You can just jump to the last part. Given that he makes such generalizations, I think the gist of her question, right, about natural talents of various races, it seems that he is racist. Someone who believes that different races possess different, distinct characteristics, abilities, or qualities. What is your definition of racism, she asks, that makes him not a racist?
Okay, so I think that the definition that most Kantians are working with is biological determinism and essentialism. I don't think they articulate that, but without, officially, but along the way, I've been able to pick this up. I think that if you take Kant's the things he's saying, he's really conflating race and national character, and he's not clear in his terms, but what he really wants to say is that the white race has had advantages because of its environmental situation, and it is able to express these talents. So it has expressed the talents, whereas other populations have the talents. They have the natural predispositions, but they were not able to express them because of their environmental situation. That's how I see that. Yeah.
So if there had been any biological determinism that provides an explanation rather than the environmental reasons, you would consider that would be a ground for consider Kant to be a racist, because there would be a biological determinism, and yet you say that there is none other than the skin color in Kant, because the rest are predispositions about the human preferences that can be explained by choices of those populations, you mean? And other than that, okay, there's no biological determinism. Okay.
Because the national character is something that is in the natural predispositions, but it's not inheritable. It's not inherited. It's not something that's biologically determined. It is a result of free will and also natural aptitude. Those two things together.
And she has another short question. Given that humans are part of nature and reason is also part of nature and is a talent that develops in nature, she's talking about reason itself, how can your distinction between human history and natural history can help Kant's position? So if reason is also a part of nature, he says, and something develops in nature, how can this sharp distinction between human history and natural history can help? That's her question.
Well, I think that because they're two different sciences, we have to keep them separate. And I don't think people are keeping them separate because they're not recognizing that they're two different sciences. And they're also not recognizing the natural predispositions that Kant is referencing are different.
Okay, thank you. So that is what you referred in the last part of your talk, I think, keeping the principles not conflated about the sciences.
Yeah.
And, and I see Umut's hands in the first, so please, Umut, go ahead, and I will ask Özlem.
Yes, thank you very much for the talk, and also welcome to our presentation. I want to ask a question about the paper that you circulated earlier before the talk, if I
Sure.
may. Towards the last part of that paper, there is a distinction between activism and science or scholarship that you mentioned, right?
Yes.
And you mentioned that some authors who claim that Kant is racist are acting more as activists rather than scholars. My question is whether that distinction really can be made in a certain context, because even and I think it's difficult for me to formulate, but let me put it like this: scholars do and should have political incentives, I think, and so because they're just because they're dealing with the truth of things, right? And saying that I'm not agreeing with scholars who claim that Kant is racist, but I think I want to make a different point about this relation between politics and scholarship. So the idea is, should we still not be critical of Kant if his writings can be used in a certain light as statements that seem to support racism? I mean, does that make sense to you?
Yeah,
I'm not sure if I was able. All right. And so what would you say about this distinction between politics and scholarship?
Well, I think we get into a lot of trouble when we do politics, because the thing is, then the politicians, the true politicians, do what they're doing now and start fighting universities because they see us as being political. I think that's a problem, and I think we've got that problem going on in the United States right now. And also, in addition, we have to teach students who are of both persuasions. At least in America, we have two political parties. So it really, if we were to take sides with one political party, we would be offending the students in the other political party. So we try to maintain a kind of neutrality in our classroom and not indicate where we're going. In terms of racism, that, I mean, obviously, in our actions and treatments of students, we should not be discriminatory. But I think as scholars, we would want to maintain a certain neutrality about historical scholarship, especially with historical scholarship, because we should, and as Seniye said, that you don't want to judge anachronistically. And you want to give a true perception of how Kant should be understood within his own historical time period. Because the truth is, we can make any historical person sound like anything, and we can judge them on all kinds of values. We're going to be judged 200 years from now by people on other standards than we had anticipated, and that doesn't seem very fair to me. But I just think that we should maintain a certain neutrality and evaluate historical figures within their own context. And if we're going to be like Michael McNulty and just say, look, this is what I'm doing. I'm engaging in anti-racism, so I'm going to look at Kant and I'm going to distort him. He's probably not going to admit it's a distortion, but at least admit what he's doing, and so we can evaluate it in that light rather than, see it as neutral scholarship.
I see. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your good question.
Thanks.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Following the Saniye's question, I would like to go back. If we were to distinguish between natural history and the history of humanity, you mentioned in your talk the influence of David Hume. We know that Immanuel Kant was influenced by Hume's conception of natural history. Yes, however, theoretically speaking, when this distinction between natural history and the history of humanity is considered from an anthropological perspective, what kind of understanding of anthropology does it lead us to? And in addition, can we say that Kant's philosophical anthropology functions in a sense as a substitute for what is referred to in psychology as developmental theory, thereby reconfiguring early modern accounts of human development rather than simply containing them? What do you think about
That's
it?
a good question. It's not my paper, but it's something I think about.
I know.
You're taking me beyond it. But what I think is what so wonderful about Kant's theory of human nature is that if we do believe that everybody shares the same natural predispositions, we know that anybody can move from one culture to another and adapt to that culture because they have the natural predispositions and to do so. And also, I think I find it very helpful in my understanding of students and other human beings that I see I don't, and other cultures. So you can see another culture and see that they have skills and they've developed their talents in a different way than we do in our culture. And I can be open to that because, hey, that's talent, that's skill, that's the technical predisposition. And then if they have different ways of expressing prudence and pragmatic predisposition, I can be open to that too, because that's just our way, their way of being prudent, and it's a little bit different than my culture, but it's still prudence. And so I think we can move between cultures and embrace other cultural realities and not be defensive toward them or judgmental toward them, because they have the same four predispositions. They just express them differently. And that is how I teach world religions. So I study other world religions, and I don't get defensive about them because they don't agree with the world religion that I agree with. But I learn from them because I see they have the same natural predispositions. They're expressing them, working them out as the religion that I work through. So I think it opens us up to other cultures and makes us more open-minded and open and not judgmental.
Thank you.
Does that help?
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Islam.
Do we have any other question? Yeah, you do have. Yeah, please go ahead, Professor Loudon.
You're talking about some important issues, Holly, and there is much to agree with in what you said, I think. Yes, Kant does use the term natural predispositions both in his natural history writings and in his human history writings. And I've wondered myself, is he using the term in the same way in these two different areas of his philosophy or not? I think you can make the case, as you've tried to do, that no, he's not using the term in the same way, although there we might fault him for not being clearer about this and perhaps even deciding, well, I need a different term here when I'm talking about human history. I shouldn't use the same term that I used in my natural history writings. But I think one issue I'd like to focus on here is the relationship between culture and race. You try very hard to distinguish culture from race. Culture, you say, is aligned with reason and final causality. Race is an issue of skin color and efficient causality, interaction with the environment one's in, and so forth. But part of the problem is that in a lot of passages where Kant discusses race, culture comes up. I mean, one of the most obvious ones is in the Menschenkunde, which is on my mind because I was the translator of this text for when we brought it out.
Thank you for doing that, by the way.
Well, but let me just draw attention to some of the race and culture connections that he claims in here. All right, this is at Menschenkunde in the Academy edition 25/1187. He says there are four races on earth. These are: one, the American people. And in that sentence, he says, the American people acquires no culture. And then the second race, he says, is the Negro race. And then he says that they have only a culture of slaves. That is, they allow themselves to be trained. And then the third race, he says, this is the Hindus. They fare a little better for him. They acquire culture in the highest degree, but only in the arts and not in the sciences. And of course, as an Enlightenment man, Kant thinks if you don't have achievement in the sciences, you're really not doing too well. And then he also adds, the Hindus never bring culture further. We don't see any cultural progress with them. And then last but definitely not least, 4, the white race contains all incentives and talents in itself. So, and this is just one passage. There are others that some others brought up this today, I believe. It does seem to me that unfortunately he does connect race with culture repeatedly, and this is part of what has upset so many people in recent years.
Okay, so you want me to respond to that?
Well, if you could, on the issue of race and culture, yeah, because I do think this is one of the real points of contention.
Okay, so my feeling is this. This is a passage that is in his lecture that is recorded by students, and I'm not trying to demean it. We take passages from his student notebooks all the time, and they're attributed to him, and so we take it as Kant having said those things. But I do want to mention these are from student lectures. And then my problem is, how do we understand them? What I see Kantians do who are influenced by Charles Mill and Emmanuel Easy, they take these passages out of his anthropology lectures and they list them. All these same passages, they just list them, and then when you look at them all together, boy, it looks racist to me. And I was persuaded too at first, because I was just looking at these passages that were cherry picked. But I'm trying to ask you and anybody who will read my papers to look at these passages in the context in which he talks about anthropology. Let's look at the other things he's saying. What are the other things he's saying in his lectures? How does he understand these things? And if you want to make a theory, see what he's really doing, he's making a theory of development, of culture. And his idea is that culture develops through certain stages, and that stage is that sometimes cultures don't develop fully. Now, why don't they develop fully? He doesn't answer that question, but it's not because they're biologically determined not to develop it. He's characterizing their culture like a national identity. And I remember I said the national identity or national characterization is a very risky, iffy thing. It is not a science. It's a risky thing, and that's what he's doing. And he knows it's risky to identify cultures like that and characterize them. But what I'm also arguing is that he takes race for names for cultures he doesn't have, or nation states he doesn't have, and he just designates races for them, so he can talk about their cultural development. In the larger picture, Robert, I know this is really a hard argument to make, but what I'm asking people to do is stop cherry picking all these statements and look at them in the larger context in which he's saying them. He's got a theory of culture. His theory of culture is that some cultures just don't develop as far as other cultures do. And there's reasons for that. He thinks it's because of climate. It's environmental. It's not because they have a nature. It is not because their nature is different. It is not because they don't have the natural predispositions. They have them. They have the capacity to develop culture, but somewhere along the line, because of free choice or because of natural aptitude, they didn't develop these other things. At least his understanding, which is also, we have to admit, is very limited. That would be my answer.
Okay. You find environmental determinism much more palatable somehow than biological determinism.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. I do not think that that is racism to say that environment causes people to be disadvantaged.
Yeah.
I think we say that in the United States too, that, you know, the way you grow up in your life, it can really hinder your ability to achieve and accomplish as much as other people. So I think environmental...
I am speaking from Hawaii, which is a very warm climate. There are a lot of intelligent people out here, actually. And back in Portland, Maine, on the East Coast, where I also spend part of the year, I'm sad to say there are a lot of stupid people out there. I don't understand the attraction of environmental determinism myself.
Now, my paper is not about whether Kant is right or not. So please understand, I am not defending Kant. I am only trying to understand him.
Okay, fair enough.
But environmental determinism does also have some things to be said, but I'm not defending environmental determinism. I'm only defending that Kant can be understood as an environmental determinist. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Even though we are not very much satisfied to what extent this is an acceptable option, but at least you save him with this from biological determinism as we take it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. That's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
At least think about it in a different light.
Okay. Seemingly we don't have any more question. So I would really thank to our dear speaker, Holly, for this very informative and very well-organized, enlightening talk. I personally really enjoyed it. Özlem, you have a question?
Yeah, I just would like to express my thanks before the closing session by referring to a personal experience. Is it available?
Yeah, please go ahead.
When I decided to write my thesis on anthropology as a research assistant, my sources, especially in English, were very limited, and I have emailed both to Holly and Professor Loden, and both of them sent me signed books, and it's a very special session for me to have both of them in the Türkiye Kant Society event. It was really interesting and very satisfying discussions for me. I just would like to express this. Thank you.
And Özlem, this must be many years ago when you were a research assistant.
Yeah,
they just
many years ago.
Kindly sent and answered emails for.
Thank you so
we do
much.
thank in the name of all Kantians in Turkey to be so kind and charitable in sharing their knowledge. Thanks for sharing this, Özlem.
Thank you.
Thank you also, Professor Loden. Maybe in some other session we will have the chance to also host you. We would love to. We will see. Okay. Thanks for all the attendees. One more time. Thank you, Holly. We hope to see you in person, maybe in Istanbul or in some other international Kant event. So good night to Istanbul folk. Good morning to Robert, and have a nice afternoon, Holly. So
thank you.
Take good care of all. Bye bye.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.